September 15th, 1944, Peleliu Island, Palau Archipelago. The air was thick with heat as the U.S. Marines, part of the 1st Marine Division, landed on the beaches of Peleliu. The sound of gunfire echoed from the east as American artillery hammered the Japanese positions in the distance. For Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, the battle had already started. The objective was clear: seize the island to secure an airbase that would pave the way for future campaigns in the Philippines. But the Marines had learned from experience Peleliu would not be easy. Chesty Puller, the most decorated Marine in history, was no stranger to the horrors of the Pacific campaign. But Peleliu would be different. The island was heavily fortified, with Japanese troops entrenched in cave systems, pillboxes, and reinforced positions, the type of defenses that had made the Marines wary of what was ahead. Yet they pressed forward, stepping off the landing craft onto the hot sandy shore, their boots sinking into the beach as they advanced, wary of the unseen enemy. A few hours into the landing, Puller's men moved past the initial beachhead, advancing deeper into the jungle. The sound of the battle still raged in the background, a constant hum of artillery, fire, machine gun rattle, and the screams of war. It was at that moment, during a brief lull, that one of the scouts, Private Robert M. Williams, spotted something odd, half buried in the dirt along the coastline. "Sir, you might want to take a look at this," Williams called out. Puller, along with several others, made their way to the site. What they found was a strange relic. A Type 95 Hago, a Japanese light tank, its once imposing frame now rusted and lifeless. The tank's engine was cold, and the turret was frozen in place. Its once proud Japanese markings had been worn away by time and battle. The Hago was a relic of earlier battles, a machine that had seen action during the early years of the Pacific War, but was now outdated, overshadowed by more advanced Allied weaponry. As the Marines gathered around it, their skepticism turned to humor. The Hago had been designed to provide mobility and firepower for the Imperial Japanese Army, but its thin armor, only about 12 to 25 millimeters thick, left it vulnerable to even the most basic Allied firepower. The Marines had faced Japanese tanks before, but this one was different. The Hago's design was archaic compared to the heavily armored tanks they had seen, such as the American M4 Sherman or the German Panther. The Marines, in their gritty humor, quickly started making jokes about the uselessness of the vehicle. "Think we can use it as a good target for the 50 calories, one," Marine said, a wry smile crossing his face. Another laughed. "Hell, a good breeze could blow it over." The M2, 50 caliber Browning machine gun, known for its devastating firepower, had been a mainstay for American infantry, tanks, and aircraft since the 1932. The Marines knew its potential all too well. The M2 was a heavy machine gun capable of shredding infantry light vehicles, and as they were about to discover Japanese tanks, Private Williams, now curious, took his M1 Garand rifle and started walking around the tank, inspecting its weak points. Then a shout went out. "Let's see what the 50 calories can do." The Marine machine gunners positioned their M2, 50 caliber on the sand, and aimed at the Hago. Without hesitation, they opened fire. The first burst of machine gun fire rang out, echoing across the beach. The sound of each round being fired was thunderous, followed by the unmistakable ping of the heavy caliber rounds striking the tank. The Japanese tank, with its thin armor, didn't stand a chance. The rounds tore through the tank's weak spots effortlessly. The M2's projectiles pierced the front armor with ease, sending a cascade of sparks and dust from the impact. The Marines watched in amusement and disbelief as the tank, which had once been part of the Japanese Army's efforts to secure ground in the Pacific, became a target of ridicule. The jokes intensified. "Guess that's one tank we don't have to worry about," one of them quipped. "No way that's stopping our infantry." But the laughter didn't mask the harsh truth. The Hago was just one example of how outclassed the Japanese were becoming. Their forces were still using old equipment, not adapted to the growing technological might of the United States. While the Japanese had initially relied on older tanks like the Hago in the early days of the Pacific War, the shift to more advanced American firepower had begun to dismantle their defenses. The M2, 50 caliber, had become an icon of American superiority on the battlefield. a weapon that had proved itself in numerous engagements from the Battle of the Bulge to the Pacific Theatre, and was now devastating the enemy's most valued vehicles. The encounter with the Hago was symbolic. The tank had been a part of Japan's early offensive strategy, but was hopelessly outdated by 1944. Even at this late stage of the war, the Japanese forces continued to deploy it, unaware of the technological disadvantage they faced. To the Marines, it was just another example of how Japan's earlier successes in places like China and the Philippines were becoming increasingly irrelevant as American military power ramped up. As Puller and his men moved forward, the sight of the useless tank stood as a stark reminder of the technological gap. It wasn't just the tanks, it was the whole system of Japanese military equipment. The M2, a .50 caliber, designed to be an anti-aircraft and anti-vehicle weapon, was now dismantling Japanese defenses with ease, proving that technology, logistics, and industrial power were the true deciding factors in this war. The Japanese had no answer for it. The tide had turned, and the Hago was one more casualty in the overwhelming push of American industrial might. The Marines left the Hago behind as they continued to advance inland, the sound of their boots crunching through the sand, replaced by the sudden roar of artillery fire in the distance. The battle for Peleliu would continue to be brutal. But for now, the Marines had a small moment of relief, a bitter laugh over a Japanese relic that had once represented the might of the Imperial Army, but now stood as nothing more than a target for their superior firepower. The sound of gunfire never ceased as the Marines pushed deeper into the island's dense jungle. The sun blazed relentlessly above, making every step feel like an eternity. The heat and humidity weighed heavily on the men of the 1st Marine Division. Each soldier was soaked in sweat, their uniforms sticking to their bodies as they navigated the treacherous terrain. But the battle for Peleliu wasn't about to ease up. For Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, the stakes couldn't have been higher. His forces were tasked with neutralizing a dug-in Japanese force that was determined to fight to the death. Puller's reputation for resilience in the face of adversity was already legendary, but this battle would test his leadership in ways no other had before. He knew the Japanese would not give up easily, and this island would be no different. As the Marines continued their advance, the discovery of the Hago tank lingered in the back of their minds. It wasn't just a source of amusement for the men. It was a grim reminder of how far the Japanese military had fallen behind. That moment when the M2, .50 caliber machine gun tore through the Hago's thin armor made one thing abundantly clear. American technological superiority had reached a point where it could shred through anything Japan had left in its arsenal. The realization hit hard. Japan, once a formidable military power that had stormed across the Pacific with startling success, was now faced with the full weight of American industrial output. The M2, .50 caliber, the M4, Sherman tank, and a host of other weapons were overwhelming the Japanese, whose earlier reliance on lighter, more mobile tanks and infantry formations was now ineffective against the sheer power of Allied firepower. Puller, ever the strategist, knew the significance of this moment. The Type 95 Hago had been a relic of the early stages of the war, but Japan's failure to upgrade its forces left them exposed. The tank was an anachronism, a vehicle that had been outclassed by new Allied weaponry, and yet Japan continued to deploy it, hoping that its mobility and firepower would make up for its shortcomings. But the U.S. Marines equipped with modern weapons and a near unlimited supply of ammunition found it laughable. As Puller and his men moved forward, the tank's discovery became more than just a footnote in the larger battle. It became a symbol of Japan's miscalculation. While the Marines pushed forward with M4 Shermans and M2, .50 caliber machine guns, the Japanese soldiers were still clinging to outdated equipment. The Hago, once a fearsome machine in its time, was now nothing more than scrap metal on a battlefield. Hours later, Puller received word of more Japanese positions ahead. The tanks may have been gone, but the Japanese were entrenched in fortified caves, pillboxes, and spider holes, waiting for any sign of weakness to exploit. The Marines were up against a different kind of fight, one that relied on tactics and endurance, not just firepower. But the realization from the Hago's defeat continued to reverberate. The Japanese had been losing ground across the Pacific, but Peleliu represented their final stand in the Palau Islands. The 42nd Division, which had taken heavy casualties earlier in the campaign, was now battling fiercely to hold the lines, but they were being outclassed. The men of the 1st Marine Division were now used to the ferocity of the Japanese counterattacks, but what gave them confidence was the knowledge that their weapons were superior. They didn't have to worry about the old tanks or the antiquated artillery that the Japanese clung to. They had something far more powerful. As the battle for Peleliu continued, the Marines would soon realize that the Japanese might never admit it, but they were running out of options. The island would fall, and with it, one more symbol of the old Japan would fade away. The Hago's pitiful remains, once a part of the Imperial Army's earlier successes, now stood as nothing more than a target for the overwhelming American might. The Marines didn't need to waste time on such relics. Their job was to keep moving forward. Peleliu wasn't just a fight against men, it was a fight against everything Japan had built up to that point. And now, with each passing hour, the cracks in their defenses grew wider. The realization that the American war machine could dismantle Japan's war effort was no longer just a theory. It was becoming an undeniable truth played out in the sight of wrecked tanks and broken fortifications. September 17, 1944, Peleliu Island. The Marines had barely moved past the beachhead when they found themselves engulfed in the chaos of battle once again. Chesty Puller, as relentless as ever, kept pushing his men forward. The Japanese forces had dug in deep, preparing for an all-out defense. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and salt water, and the sound of explosions reverberated through the jungle as the battle raged on. The sight of the Hago tank, now reduced to a shell, stuck in the back of many men's minds. It was a reminder of just how unprepared the Japanese were against the overwhelming might of the United States. Puller knew the battle would not be decided by tanks alone, but the Hago symbolized something much larger, the inadequacy of the Japanese military in the face of American industrial power. As Puller and his division moved further inland, they encountered increasingly fortified Japanese positions. The Marines pushed into the heart of the island, encountering a well-coordinated defense that had been prepared months in advance. The Japanese were using every tactic they had to stall the American advance. It wasn't just soldiers, it was artillery, machine guns and anti-tank positions, all hidden within the thick jungle and rugged terrain. Peleliu was not a place to be taken lightly. But even with the Japanese dug into their positions, there was an undeniable shift in momentum. The Marines were equipped with superior firepower, and that made all the difference. Tanks, artillery and air support came together to systematically crush any hope the Japanese had of holding the island. While the Hago's defeat had been symbolic, it was part of a larger pattern. It wasn't just the tanks that were outdated, it was the entire strategy of the Japanese defense. Private James H. Brooks had seen it firsthand. He'd fought through the brutal terrain, and now standing on the precipice of another Japanese defensive position, he understood what the Hago represented. It was a relic of the past, and so too was much of Japan's war machine. The Marines had already destroyed countless positions, and each encounter seemed to underscore the technological gap. The Japanese had no answer to the power of the M2, 50 caliber, the American Sherman tank, and the precision of American air superiority. The realization that Japan's once feared war machine was no match for the might of the United States was becoming clear with each passing hour. Brooks glanced over at his fellow Marines. There was no fear in their eyes. The Japanese were fighting desperately, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the island would fall. Every battle the Marines had fought in the Pacific from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima had been brutal. But Peleliu was different. It wasn't just about fighting an enemy. It was about proving the superiority of American technology, strategy, and willpower. The Marines were not just soldiers, they were the embodiment of the industrial might of the United States, advancing methodically and relentlessly. The sound of another M2, 50 caliber firing interrupted his thoughts. It was followed by a series of explosions as the Marines broke through another Japanese position. Private Brooks was about to move forward when the radio crackled to life. Puller's orders. "Move out. We're going after the next defensive line." The message was short, sharp, and to the point. Puller wasn't one for unnecessary words. He led from the front, always in the thick of the battle, directing his men with precision and decisiveness. Brooks and the others moved forward again, the jungle parting before them like the inevitable passage of time. They were unstoppable now. The momentum was with them. As the day wore on, it became clear that the Japanese resistance, while fierce, was fading. The battle had shifted from an intense fight for survival to a methodical dismantling of Japanese defenses. The Marines had proven their superiority not only in numbers, but in sheer technological might. The Hago had been just one piece of evidence, a testament to Japan's failure to adapt. By the evening of September 17th, the Marines had pushed into deeper positions on Peleliu. The Japanese were still holding out in some areas, but their will to fight was broken. Puller knew that while the battle was not over, the momentum had already shifted decisively in favor of the Americans. September 18th, 1944, Peleliu Island. By the morning of the 18th, the fighting had become a brutal, grinding slog. The Japanese forces were now holed up in caves and pillboxes, determined to fight to the last man. The Marines pressed on, pushing deeper into the island, knowing that every inch gained came with a price. Chesty Puller, ever resolute, surveyed the battlefield. The Marines had already taken significant ground, but the Japanese defenders were not backing down. Puller's radio crackled, and he was informed that they were nearing one of the last strongholds of the Japanese defense. The 42nd Division had been wiped out in the previous days of combat, but these final pockets of resistance were determined to hold at any cost. The Marines knew the Japanese were cornered. Their tanks, like the Hago, had been decimated, and their infantry was now relying on their fortifications and limited supplies. But their spirit was broken, and the firepower of the United States was now overwhelming. As the Marines advanced, the thick jungle gave way to a sprawling network of caves and bunkers, each one a potential death trap. It was in these final defensive positions that the last vestiges of Japanese resolve would be tested. The shelling from American artillery and the continuous barrage from the M2 50-caliber machine guns had already taken a heavy toll on the enemy. The few remaining Japanese tanks, like the Type 97 Chiha, had either been destroyed or abandoned. Private Richard A. Daniels crouched low behind the thick brush as he peered over the top of his rifle. He could hear the muffled sounds of enemy chatter coming from the bunker ahead. It wasn't the sound of organized resistance. It was the desperate murmur of men who knew their days were numbered. The battle for Peleliu had now entered its final stages. Daniels and his squad were tasked with clearing the remaining positions. He breathed heavily, the sweat stinging his eyes, and wiped it away with the back of his hand. "Stay focused," he muttered under his breath, glancing at his fellow Marines. They were all exhausted, their faces smeared with dirt and grime. But there was no fear, just a steely determination. The radio crackled again, and Puller's voice came through. "Advance. We clear these positions, and we take this island." The Marines surged forward, moving with purpose toward the enemy strongholds. The M4 Sherman tanks followed closely behind, providing the firepower needed to breach the heavily fortified positions. Daniels and the others could feel the ground shake as the tanks fired their main guns, sending shockwaves through the jungle. The sound of explosions and machine gun fire filled the air as the Marines closed in on the Japanese defenders. As the Marines neared one of the final pillboxes, Daniels could see the faces of the Japanese soldiers inside, hollow eyes, grim expressions. They knew their end was near. And as the Marines advanced, the final pieces of Japan's defenses crumbled. With one last desperate attempt, the Japanese soldiers inside the pillbox opened fire. But their resistance was futile. The M2 50 caliber, mounted on a nearby Marine vehicle, tore through the fortifications with ease. In moments, the pillbox was silenced, and the Japanese defenders inside were either dead or captured. The battle for Peleliu was winding down. The last organized pockets of resistance had been wiped out, and the island was slowly falling under American control. The cost had been high, the Marines had suffered heavy casualties, and the Japanese had fought fiercely to the bitter end. But in the end, the overwhelming firepower of the United States had proven unstoppable. Daniels stood at the edge of the pillbox, surveying the battlefield. The ground was littered with the wreckage of destroyed Japanese equipment tanks, artillery pieces, and broken machinery that had once represented the might of the Imperial Japanese Army. The sight of the Type 95 Hago and its destruction now felt like a distant memory, a symbol of Japan's failure to keep up with the changing tides of the war. The Japanese military, once feared and revered, had been reduced to broken remnants in the face of American technological dominance. As the Marines raised the flag over Peleliu, the weight of the battle began to sink in. The island was now in American hands, but the cost had been steep. Puller's men had fought with unwavering resolve, but they knew the war was far from over. Peleliu was just one step in a much larger campaign, the conquest of the Pacific and the ultimate defeat of Japan. For Daniels and the others, it was a victory hard-earned. They had faced the full brunt of Japan's remaining strength and emerged victorious. But the island of Peleliu would haunt them, a reminder of the brutal nature of war and the high price of victory. As the Marines prepared to move on to the next phase of the campaign, they couldn't forget the ghosts of the past battles they had fought and the new battles yet to come.